30 April 1943. Somewhere in the grey Atlantic, roughly a mile off the southern coast of Spain near the town of Huelva, a fisherman named José Antonio Rey Marin notices something strange drifting on the morning swell. It is a body. A man in uniform, face down in the water, a briefcase chained to his wrist. The fisherman pulls the dead man from the sea and rows him ashore. Within hours, the Spanish authorities have been notified. Within days, German intelligence has read every document that was in that briefcase. And within weeks, Adolf Hitler has redirected his most powerful armies to the wrong side of Europe. The dead man's name, according to his identity papers, is Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He carries a photograph of his fiancée, a bill from his London tailor, a letter from his bank manager complaining about an overdraft, a theatre ticket stub, and most crucially a pair of personal letters from senior British officers that reveal, in the most confidential terms, that the Allied invasion of southern Europe will target not Sicily, which the Germans had correctly predicted, but Greece and Sardinia. The Germans are convinced. The deception works perfectly. There is just one problem with Major William Martin. He does not exist. He has never existed. The body drifting off the Spanish coast belonged to a homeless Welsh man named Glynndwr Michael, who died in London of rat poison, and was then transformed by one of the most audacious intelligence operations in the history of warfare into a fictional officer carrying fictional secrets that would reshape the entire war in the Mediterranean. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat. By the autumn of 1942, Allied planners faced a crisis of geography. The war in North Africa was turning in the Allies' favor, and it was becoming clear that the next major offensive must come from the south, a seaborne invasion of occupied Europe from across the Mediterranean. The obvious, almost unavoidable target was Sicily. The island sat at the very center of the Mediterranean, its airfields and ports positioned like a stepping stone between Tunisia and the Italian mainland. Every competent strategist on both sides knew it. Winston Churchill himself had once remarked that only a fool would attack Sicily, which was precisely why the Germans expected it. General Sir Harold Alexander, coordinating Allied forces in North Africa, understood the problem with brutal clarity. If the Germans reinforced Sicily to the level their intelligence suggested was coming, the invasion could become a catastrophe. A defended coastline, adequate warning, and panzer divisions dug in across mountainous terrain, these were the conditions for slaughter. The Allies needed a miracle of misdirection. They needed the Germans to look the other way. Previous deception operations had achieved mixed results. Dummy tanks and false radio transmissions could fool aerial reconnaissance, but the Germans were experienced at reading strategic patterns. To redirect entire army groups to convince the Wehrmacht High Command to strip Sicily of its best divisions and send them to Greece and Sardinia required something far more convincing than rubber vehicles and fictional signals traffic. It required what intelligence officers call a controlled source, something the Germans would believe came directly from the British without any possibility of suspicion. It required, in short, a man they could trust. A dead man. The idea originated within a remarkable corner of British intelligence known as Section 17M, part of the Naval Intelligence Division, led by a man whose talent for lateral thinking bordered on the theatrical, Commander Ewan Montague. Working alongside him was a young flight lieutenant named Charles Chumley of MI5, pronounced, in the uniquely baffling fashion of the British upper classes, Chumley. Together, they developed a plan that would later be written up in a 1953 memoir so extraordinary that its publishers initially refused to believe it was non-fiction. The plan was this. Obtain a human body. Dress it as a Royal Marines officer. Plant upon it a carefully constructed false identity, complete with personal effects convincing enough to pass German scrutiny. Then introduce it into the sea near the Spanish coast. Spain, though officially neutral, maintained intelligence relationships with Nazi Germany, where it would be found by Spanish authorities and, predictably, examined by the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The documents in the briefcase would do the rest. The construction of Major William Martin was an exercise in obsessive detail that modern intelligence professionals still study with admiration. Montague and Chumley understood that German intelligence would not simply read the operational letters. They would examine every item on the body for corroboration. Inconsistencies in personal effects: a photograph too new, a letter without the wear of being read and reread, a wallet with no coins could unravel the entire fiction. And so they built a life. Martin's fiancée, Pam, was a real woman, a clerk at MI5 who agreed to pose for photographs. The love letters in his breast pocket were composed by a female colleague with considerable literary talent, carrying the self-conscious ardor of wartime romance. His identity card showed deliberate minor damage from being carried in a wallet. His bill from the Naval and Military Club in London bore a date consistent with a recent stay. The overdraft letter from his bank manager at Lloyd's was genuine correspondence, slightly altered. Even the theater stub from a recent West End production was authentic, recovered from the dustbin of a colleague who had actually attended. The body itself presented its own grim logistics. Glndwr Michael had died in January 1943. His corpse was preserved in dry ice and stored in a specially constructed canister at a mortuary in London under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. The pathologist consulted confirmed that the body, if introduced into cold sea water, would present consistent with drowning. The cause of death, ingestion of rat poison causing liver failure, was obscure enough that a Spanish post-mortem, conducted without full laboratory facilities, would not identify it. The uniform, badges, and equipment were all sourced from genuine military stocks. On 19 April 1943, the canister containing Major Martin was loaded aboard His Majesty's submarine Seraph at Holy Loch on the Clyde. The submarine's commanding officer, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, was given sealed orders and told only that the operation was of the highest national importance. 10 days later, in the early hours of 30 April, Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva. The canister was opened on deck. The body of Glndwr Michael, dressed in the uniform of a British officer, was gently placed into the water and allowed to drift towards the Spanish coast. The briefcase was already chained to his wrist. The body was recovered on the morning of 30 April, exactly as planned. The Spanish authorities initially treated the matter as a straightforward case of a military casualty. However, the local German agent Adolf Klaus, operating through the German embassy in Madrid, moved with extraordinary speed. Within 48 hours, the contents of the briefcase had been photographed and transmitted to Berlin. The Abwehr's analysis concluded, with high confidence, that the documents were genuine. The letter addressed to General Harold Alexander from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, detailed Allied intentions with precisely the kind of irritated frankness that characterizes private correspondence between senior officers. It mentioned Sicily only as a decoy. The real targets, it implied, were the Peloponnese and a western Mediterranean island. The German response exceeded anything Montague and Chumley had dared to hope. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's finest commanders, was dispatched to Greece. An entire panzer division was transferred from France to the Balkans. Torpedo boats and defensive materials were redirected to Sardinia and Corsica. When Allied forces landed in Sicily on 10 July 1943, they found a coastline defended at half the expected strength. Several divisions were still in Greece, waiting for an invasion that never came. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans ran their own deception operations with considerable sophistication, particularly through the Abwehr's manipulation of Allied agents. What made mincemeat exceptional, and what the Germans could not easily replicate, was its one-time, irreversible nature. A turned agent can always return. A false radio network can be interrogated. But a dead man cannot be questioned, cannot crack under pressure, cannot be confronted in an interrogation room. The body was the perfect source precisely because it was silent. The Americans ran parallel deception operations for the Sicily invasion, collectively known as Operation Barclay, involving false wireless traffic and the theatrical deployment of General George Patton as a notional army commander whose movements were designed to suggest a Balkan target. These were useful reinforcements. But British intelligence assessments conducted after the war concluded that mincemeat alone was responsible for the diversion of forces that materially affected the course of the Sicilian campaign. American deception relied on volume, mincemeat relied on a single, devastating, unanswerable source. The concept of the body plant was not entirely new. British intelligence had discussed similar ideas as far back as the First World War, but mincemeat was the first execution at strategic scale, and it remains the definitive example. The principles it established that the most convincing intelligence sources are those that appear discovered rather than delivered, and that personal detail creates belief more reliably than operational plausibility became foundational doctrine in British and Allied deception planning for the remainder of the war. The question of what mincemeat actually achieved is one that military historians have debated with some care. The Sicily landings on 10 July 1943 were not without cost. Some 5,500 Allied soldiers were killed during the 38-day campaign, but they succeeded. The island fell. Italy itself was invaded in September. Mussolini had already been deposed in July, partly as a result of the military humiliation that mincemeat helped to engineer. Whether these outcomes would have been achieved without the deception is impossible to say with certainty. What the records confirm is that 2 full German divisions were elsewhere when they might have been in Sicily, and that the Axis High Command's confidence in their strategic assessments was shaken in ways that had consequences throughout the Italian campaign. Ewan Montague published his account, The Man Who Never Was, in 1953, and it became an immediate bestseller. A film adaptation followed in 1956. For decades, the real identity of the body remained officially classified. It was not until 1996, following sustained research by historian Roger Morgan, that Glynwr Michael was publicly identified. He is now commemorated on a memorial in his hometown of Aberbargod in Wales, which reads, Glynwr Michael served his country also as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. The original operational files including Montague's working papers, the photographs of Pam, and the correspondence used to build Major Martin's identity are held at the National Archives at Kew in London. Visitors to the archive can request access to the files of Operation Mincemeat, and read, in the original typescript, the instructions that sent a dead man to mislead a continent. Return, for a moment, to the morning of 30 April 1943. To a fisherman in a small boat off the coast of Spain, pulling a dead man from the water. He does not know that he is handling one of the most carefully constructed fictions in the history of warfare. He does not know that the soaked letters in the dead man's briefcase will redirect German armies. He does not know that the fiancée in the breast pocket photograph is a clerk in a London office building, very much alive. He sees only a body, and a briefcase, and the quiet dignity owed to any man pulled from the sea. Glynwr Michael was buried in Huelva on 2 May 1943, with full military honors, as Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The Germans sent a representative. The Spanish maintained their official neutrality. And somewhere in London, in a building that does not appear on any public record, Ewan Montague and Charles Chumley waited for word that their operation had worked. It had worked better than anyone had imagined possible. Because the men who designed mincemeat had understood something that generals with armored divisions and bomber fleets sometimes forget. That the most powerful weapon in any war is not the one that destroys the enemy's body. It is the one that deceives his mind. That battles are not always won by strength. Sometimes they are won by silence, by patience, by a theater stub in a dead man's pocket and a love letter written by someone who never met him. The Allies needed the Germans to look the wrong way. And so Britain sent a man who had never lived to carry secrets that were never real, across a sea he had never sailed, to a country he had never visited. And it worked. Every division redirected. Every tank that drove to Greece instead of Sicily. Every German soldier standing on the wrong coastline, watching the wrong horizon, waiting for an invasion that never came. They built a man who never lived. And he helped win a war.